Welcome to our talk on the Cold War. I am Dr. Elizabeth Spaulding, and I am happy to be with you again. I am a political science professor who draws on political science and history and theory in my teaching and research. I am also chairman of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, which is an educational nonprofit organization that also has a museum. So I'd like to let you know that you have a standing invitation to visit the Victims of Communism Museum in Washington, D.C. What is the Cold War? Here's Harry Truman, the president who first saw and identified the Cold War. I suppose that history will remember my term in office as the years when the Cold War began to overshadow our lives, Truman said in his presidential farewell address of January 1953. I have had hardly a day in office that has not been dominated by this all-embracing struggle, this conflict between those who love freedom and those who would lead the world back into slavery and darkness. And always in the background, there has been the atomic bomb. So think on these words. They get to the essence of the Cold War and the derivative problem posed by nuclear weapons. Truman was the most significant statesman in the United States and among its allies at a critical time. He could have made different decisions. Not everything he did by any stretch was perfect. But he got the Cold War largely right, both in real time and, as it turned out, for the future. But when history says that my term of office saw the beginning of the Cold War, it will also say that in those 8 years, we have set the course that can win it. This is Truman continuing in his farewell address. We have succeeded in carving out a new set of policies to attain peace. Positive policies, policies of world leadership, policies that express faith in other free people. We have averted World War III up to now, and we may already have succeeded in establishing the conditions which can keep that war from happening as far as man can see. The Cold War is a case study in not only arguably the most important foreign policy in American history, but also in presidential statesmanship in a time of unprecedented crisis. The Cold War was the most protracted conflict of modern times. It was highly unconventional and different from previous conflicts. World War I and World War II were great sweeping hot wars that shaped our modern history and world, and the Cold War grows from them. The world wars did not match, though, the length or complexity of the ideological, strategic, political, economic, diplomatic, and moral struggle that occupied the superpowers, that's the United States and the Soviet Union, and all other powers on every continent for over 45 years. The Cold War was waged on many fronts on those continents and by different forms of governments, liberal democracies, totalitarian communist regimes, and everything in between. It included grand strategy, public diplomacy, secret diplomacy, what we sometimes call back-channel diplomacy, economics, religion, and cultural exchanges, and disagreements and face-offs. There were hot shooting wars in Korea and Vietnam, in which the United States lost tens of thousands of active military personnel and dedicated civilians. From the communists, there were purges, false imprisonments, torture, forced deportations, the Gulag, and man-made famines that killed millions upon millions of men, women, and children. There was also the Cuban Missile Crisis, which brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. At stake in the Cold War was the future of mankind, of each and every person, of each and every family, of each and every community, of each and every country. Would the world be dominated by the forces of communist totalitarianism, spearheaded by the Soviet Union, or inspired by the principles of political and economic freedom embodied in the United States? If the aggressive, expansionist drive of the USSR had not been contained, much, if not all, of Western Europe would have joined Eastern and Central Europe in being forced into communism. This would have isolated the United States strategically, politically, and economically. Adding that in 1949, China also came under communist rule, the United States would then have faced powerful, hostile regimes to the east and to the west. It would not have had the same allies that it has to this day. It would not have been able to lead and contribute to what we call the liberal world order. The free world would have ceased to exist. The West and Western civilization would have ended. Now, when World War II ended and the soldiers, the GIs, the airmen, everybody came home, and the American people expected a return to normalcy. So ordinarily, that would have meant prioritizing domestic over foreign affairs. Most people hoped that they could turn over the major responsibilities for international affairs to America's wartime allies, and to the new United Nations organization. But almost 6 debilitating years of war had reduced Great Britain to a shadow of itself. And though not clear to all at the end of World War II in 1945, the Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, aimed to proceed with its grand design of communizing the world. As for the UN, it was both new and untested, and quickly became a Cold War arena. There was no one to protect America, its interests, and its allies, but America itself. For over 4 decades and under 9 presidential administrations, Democratic as well as Republican, the United States pursued first a strategic policy of containment of the Soviet Union and communism, then a policy of détente and accommodation, and finally, a strategy of renewed containment to counter, pressure, and undermine what President Ronald Reagan called an evil empire. Today's world would be far different if the United States, at the cost of tens of thousands of American lives and many billions of dollars, had not waged and won the Cold War. The first stage of the Cold War is containment. Now, as with any great period in politics and history, the story includes what ifs. So what if Franklin Roosevelt had died a few months earlier in 1945 and his then vice president, Henry Wallace, had become president? That didn't happen. Instead, we got Harry Truman. He was from Missouri, and he knew farming and small business, and he held strong political and religious convictions. He was a student of history and an experienced US senator. He believed in liberal democracy and the rule of law. As president, Truman looked at communist totalitarianism and Stalin's Marxist-Leninist ideology. He saw that the Red Army was staying put in the countries that it had liberated in World War II. He saw that the Soviets were violating wartime agreements and were imposing communist governments throughout Eastern and Central Europe. By the time he sat on the stage listening to the one and only Winston Churchill, former British Prime Minister, give his instantly famous remarks in 1946 in Fulton, Missouri, about the Iron Curtain. Truman had already concluded that the Cold War was, as he often put it, a conflict between good and evil, freedom and tyranny, liberal democracy and totalitarianism, capitalism and communism, theism and atheism. At the beginning of America's involvement in the Cold War, Truman understood the regime distinction. He saw what the Nazis did before and after World War II. He saw the devastation that was permitted by appeasement. He knew that before Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the two tyrannical states had banded together to divide Europe, even the world, between them. From the regime distinction, Truman saw the power aspect of the Cold War. He knew that the Soviet Union, the Kremlin, was able to advance because their Red Army was staying in the countries that they had liberated and were installing communist governments. Truman also got the why part of Soviet behavior and actions because he grasped the role of ideology and that Stalin and his followers believed in communism. That means the one-party totalitarian regime, the abolition of private property and individual rights, the crushing of family, community, and religious faiths. Stalin and his followers not only believed in communism, but they also wanted to promote and spread their inevitable alternative, that's how they viewed it, in a global way. One of Truman's most important explanations of the East-West conflict is his 1947 speech before the US Congress, arguing for the Cold War strategy that would quickly bear his name. This is called the Truman Doctrine speech, and it's worth listening to on YouTube. The core message is Truman's Cold War assessment of two ways of life. In his words, at the present moment in world history, nearly every nation must choose between alternative ways of life. The choice is too often not a free one. One way of life is based upon the will of the majority and is distinguished by free institutions, representative government, free elections, guarantees of individual liberty, freedom of speech and religion, and freedom from political oppression. The second way of life is based upon the will of a minority, forcibly imposed upon the majority. It relies upon terror and oppression, a controlled press and radio, fixed elections, and the suppression of personal freedoms. The Truman Doctrine was first applied in giving political and military aid to Greece and Turkey. But Truman stressed overall the new international position for the United States. In the absence of an effective United Nations, America was the one nation capable of defending freedom and establishing peace. Here's Truman again. This is no more than a frank recognition that totalitarian regimes imposed upon free peoples by direct or indirect aggression undermine the foundations of international peace and hence the security of the United States. Truman underscored that a primary objective of Cold War policy was to create conditions in which the United States and other nations worked out a way of life free from coercion. While no government was perfect, he added, one of the chief virtues of a democracy is that its defects are always visible and under democratic processes can be pointed out and corrected. So the Truman Doctrine was foundational. The institutions and arrangements that resulted, including the Truman Doctrine itself, but also the Marshall Plan and the North Atlantic Treaty, soon to be NATO, which we still have, and other arrangements, all of this undergirded American foreign policy for much of the Cold War and the post-Cold War era, what we're still in. The United States and its allies needed to build up their strength. Because of what he thought, said, and did, Stalin was not to be trusted, accommodated, or negotiated with. if the United States negotiated one day with the Soviet Union, it could only be from a position of strength. The loss of freedom anywhere was considered a loss of freedom everywhere. And this was all accepted and appreciated by Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson. And until America is stuck in Vietnam partway through, Truman's containment, with some variations along the way, was really every president's approach. That brings us to the second stage in the Cold War, which is détente. For the West, détente meant a relaxation of tensions between the free world and the communist world. Détente came about in part because of US defense and domestic spending decisions and their effect on our economy, the Vietnam War, an ongoing Soviet military buildup, and nuclear parity between the superpowers, and equality was reached. The symmetry that began in the 1950s in the Eisenhower era and continued under John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson became a full-fledged commitment to what we call arms control treaties. The détente presidents, from Richard Nixon through Jimmy Carter, shared the expectation that the Soviets would honor arms control treaties and respond with moderation in their own military spending and actions. Détente is grounded fundamentally in removing the regime distinction and seeing and seeking peace outside that. Against the backdrop of the gold and glitter of the great Kremlin Palace in Moscow, President Nixon, who had once been the poster child for a Cold Warrior, gave an internationally televised address in May 1972. There can be true peace only when the weak are as safe as the strong, he said. Containment had sought to block further communist gains and to plant the seeds for the weakening and reversal of communism. By contrast, détente accepted and legitimated communism as a political system on equal footing with liberal democracy. Nixon thought, perhaps hoped, that the communists would moderate their behavior if they were made to feel safe. If we did not want peace, he said, we would not have worked so hard at reaching an agreement on the limitation of nuclear arms, at achieving a settlement of Berlin, at maintaining peace in the Middle East, at establishing better relations with the Soviet Union, with the People's Republic of China, with other nations of the world. By making the Soviets and Chinese comfortable and equal partners in diplomacy, Nixon hoped to settle the Cold War and replace it with what he viewed as standard great power, balance of power politics. He started with a drawdown in Vietnam and a drastic drop in defense spending there and elsewhere. And then he concentrated on triangular diplomacy with respect to the USSR and the PRC. The PRC is the People's Republic of China, the communists there. Détente, Western style, sought to establish stability and safety, but it ended up giving cover to the communists. The Soviets had already commenced what they called wars of national liberation, supporting them all over the place under Nikita Khrushchev, long before détente. The Cold War then was already global and on all fronts before Nixon's election. The communists still wanted victory. They believed that what they called the correlation of forces was on their side, and that peaceful coexistence, in their terms, meant advancing world socialism through every means short of direct war between the superpowers. Jimmy Carter retained from détente the notion that the United States should strive for stability and strategic parity with the Soviets, and added that nuclear annihilation posed the worst possible threat. And he pursued the next round of arms control talks And he also stressed world order issues and human rights, and aimed to bypass the Cold War by declaring, as he put it, that the West was now free of an inordinate fear of communism. Carter continued Nixon's tilt toward China. He diplomatically recognized the People's Republic of China and de-recognized America's official ally at the time, the Republic of China, and that's Taiwan, which is so much in the news these days. In the developing world, as communists advanced in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, Carter identified poverty rather than ideology as the real problem. So for him, the Cold War was more of a problem that was mostly restricted to Europe. Now, what were the results of détente? On the plus side, there were dissidents, those are dissenters, people who were resisting behind the iron and bamboo curtains, who took seriously the meaning of what was going on with the Helsinki Accords and other pro-freedom statements in the West. And these dissidents made heroic, sustained efforts to criticize and weaken communism from within, from behind the Iron Curtain. Many in the West also became versed in a rich language of human rights that upholds the dignity of the individual and free, open, democratic governments. But the negative dominated, and it's instructive to look at détente from the communist perspective. So taking the détente era as a whole from Nixon through Carter, here's how the communists define the relaxation of tensions. The Cultural Revolution continued to rage in China, in the People's Republic of China. The Soviets signed a friendship pact with India and made inroads into what's called the non-aligned world. The Soviets signed the SALT I and ABM arms control treaties and proceeded to violate the terms. Communists took over Ethiopia, Cambodia, Vietnam, Angola, Mozambique, and Laos. The USSR signed the Helsinki Accords and then proceeded to violate them. At the same time, they got their post-World War II borders legitimized, and they also got various trade benefits out of the deal. Jews in the Soviet Empire were neither allowed to worship nor allowed to leave for Israel and elsewhere. The Kremlin deployed SS-20 nuclear missiles that could reach targets in Western Europe. Communists seized power in Afghanistan. The Soviets signed the next arms control agreement, SALT II, and they also violated that one. Communists took power in Nicaragua, and the Soviet Union invaded and occupied Afghanistan, and the communists supported and funded large portions of the nuclear freeze movement. And this list is not exhaustive. The third stage of the Cold War is the renewal of containment. Ronald Reagan believed that détente was fundamentally flawed and that the communists had exploited it whenever and wherever possible. If anything, he thought détente had helped the communists and thus perpetuated the Cold War. In his pre-presidential speeches, radio addresses, and other writings, Reagan put forth a serious critique of what was not working in his view, and how the communists still believed in the spread of their totalitarian ideology and the power and influence of their empire. By the time he became president, he argued that the Soviets were still communists who were committed to world revolution, and yet there were serious weaknesses within their empire. Under the circumstances of the 1980s, Reagan took what had been stated, though not fully enacted, by Truman and his immediate successors, and carried containment to its logical conclusion. Based on intelligence reports and his lifelong study, Reagan concluded that Soviet communism was cracking and ready to crumble. Now, there are many Reagan speeches and statements that can help you understand his approach, and you can watch them, not just listen to them on YouTube. President Reagan's June 1982 address to the British Parliament is a good place to start. He said there that the Soviet Union was gripped by a great revolutionary crisis. Then, in what was unthinkable at the time, he predicted that the march of freedom and democracy will leave Marxism-Leninism on the ash heap of history, as it has left other tyrannies which stifle the freedom and muzzle the self-expression of the people. Main Reagan themes are present, including about the Soviet Union's economic difficulties and its steep decline compared to itself in the 1950s and relative to the current day. As Reagan said, the Soviet Union is not immune from the reality of what is going on in the world. It has happened in the past. A small ruling elite either mistakenly attempts to ease domestic unrest through greater repression and foreign adventure, or it chooses a wiser course. It begins to allow its people a voice in their own destiny. Reagan suggested that the United States, and more broadly, the West, would pursue policies to push the Soviet Union into a wiser course. Then Reagan acted on these words. He directed his national security team to develop a plan to end the Cold War by winning it. Now, he did not know the outcome, but he said trying to win the Cold War should be the frame of reference. From that plan came a multifaceted foreign policy that included covert or secret support of the Solidarity movement in Poland, an increase in what we call pro-freedom public diplomacy, a worldwide campaign to reduce Soviet access to Western high technology, and an effort to hurt the Soviet economy by driving down the price of oil and limiting Soviet natural gas exports to the West. This foreign policy also supported anti-communist forces in countries like Afghanistan, Nicaragua, Angola, and Cambodia. And the results were largely positive, including a Soviet pullout from Afghanistan, the election of a democratic government in Nicaragua, I know it's different now, and the removal of 40,000 Cuban troops from Angola and the holding of UN-monitored elections there. And this foreign policy included the Strategic Defense Initiative, known as SDI to its supporters and Star Wars by skeptics. SDI forced the Soviets to realize that they could not compete technologically with the United States, and that Reagan actually aimed to neutralize the nuclear threat. This multi-pronged strategy was enacted with great timing. Reagan saw the political, economic, and moral rot at the core of the Soviet Union. He pointed out the rot, and he built up American and Western strength of all kinds. Then, from that position of strength, Reagan met with the Soviets. And as he entered these diplomatic waters, he often said, "Trust but verify." And he found that he was able to do so with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. Reagan quipped that he would have met with Gorbachev's predecessors, but they kept dying on him. This is another what if of history. What if Gorbachev's predecessors had not kept dying on Reagan? Gorbachev in the end was different, though, not because he wanted to change the Soviet Union. Ultimately, he was different because he had to change the Soviet Union. He thought he could allow just a little political openness, and in so doing, he was forced to change. And his government, a communist totalitarian regime with an empire of captive nations, was forced to change, and in a relatively short time, collapsed. You should have a sense now of the Cold War, and you may ask, when did it end? The ending of the Cold War is not one specific date. It really goes from 1989 through 1991. This period is the coda to the history covered in this talk. At VOC, we refer to 1989 as the year of miracles throughout Europe. Many people and their actions are responsible for this year of miracles that took decades in the making. It is vividly represented in the Berlin Wall coming down, being taken down in November of that year. For the next 2 years, the Soviet communists tried to hold on to an increasingly smaller area, including the use of armed force in the Baltic states. But at Christmas time, 1991, the Soviet Union was forced to collapse, and its unelected communist president resigned. On June 4th, 1989, the Chinese Communist Party and its People's Liberation Army killed thousands of peaceful protesters, many of them students not much older than you, in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. While the Cold War between the United States and its allies and the USSR and its captive nations came to an end, communism did not end. So at VOC, we refer to 1989 as the year of miracles and tears. And more than 1.5 billion people still live under communist regimes today. For that history, as well as more about the Cold War, I invite you to visit us at the Victims of Communism Museum in Washington, D.C. I think we might have time for a couple of questions. And we are joined now by Lily McHale, who is our Associate Director of Academic Programs. Lily.
Thank you, Dr. Spalding, and thank you for that lecture. And all of you guys have the chance to ask questions in the chat, so feel free to type those and we can answer them for you. We have a couple already. So first off, one student asks, is it fair to say that the Cold War is going through a sort of revival these days?
That's an excellent question. And there are a lot of people, including many experts, both in policy and in the academic world, who are talking about a Cold War II. But this time around, there are more players involved. So those who talk about Cold War II, they're looking at what's going on with China, which is still communist China, still the People's Republic of China. They're looking at what we would call the leftovers in Russia that are still influenced by a communist history. There are other factors too, but certainly what Vladimir Putin's doing is related to the fact that he was formed by the Soviet Union. And then also perhaps some other actors that are problematic. So North Korea, which is communist as well, Iran, which is authoritarian, near totalitarian, but not communist. And then all of that together gives you something that, because so much of it is an ideological struggle that covers all different areas, like I mentioned in the original Cold War, that we could talk about this as Cold War II. And I think there's some merit to that. It doesn't mean that what the United States and its allies, what the West, broadly speaking, which is not just a geographic location anymore, will respond the same exact way. But some of what it's doing resembles what we did during the Cold War, including what I would call, roughly speaking, an overall peace through strength approach that we associate so much with presidents like Truman and Reagan.
Thank you for that response. And another student asks, how prevalent is communism today?
Right. So I mentioned that it still affects over 1.5 billion people around the world. There are still 5 communist countries. I'm not going to tell you, you guys can go look them up afterwards as part of your discussion. And then there are what we are calling countries that are on the rise in socialism and communism. Sometimes they even elected it in. So for example, Venezuela right now is a socialist country that elected that. Now they wish they could get rid of it, but they can't, because now there's not a real rule of law. There's not, it's not a democracy. And a lot of, I mentioned Nicaragua very briefly in my remarks, and that's a country now that is going through a resurgence in terms of socialism, if not communism. So it's still a problem today. It affects over 1/5 of the world's population. And as a result, it affects all the rest of us. And then there are things that become popular about communism sometimes, and that you see in pockets throughout the whole world, including in the United States. Some of the things that we should be able to talk about actually derive from what we would call cultural Marxism. And so there should be more and more education and a lot of sunlight, a lot of discussion about what that means so that people understand those topics too. And that's derivative of, but it's different from what we're talking about with the communist countries that are still, you really wouldn't want to live in those.
Another student asks, who particularly won the Cold War?
That's another great question. It's not one person. It's not one country. It's, I think though, it's largely something that connects a lot of people in a lot of countries to one idea. So, communism is ultimately all about repression, about the party and then the state deciding everything for you and imposing it on you. And so those who fought communism all the way through, they talk about freedom and they fight for freedom. And I know that seems like a somewhat vague word in some ways, but it really came to mean, a negative part against communism, but it also came to mean in the Cold War a positive part, which was for individual rights, which was for what we would call loosely like free government, which would include rule of law, consent of the governed, all the things that you're studying probably in your classes you've talked about when you're talking about the Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution, for example, or primarily. And also all of the mediating institutions. If you're in high school, maybe you've heard of Tocqueville. So he popularized that in his study of America. And those are things that we just take for granted. They're in the fabric of who we are. And so that includes everything from, your local school board to a church or a synagogue. The family is under attack by communism in all ways throughout history, ever since it was a theory that almost immediately became an ideology under Marx. And so all these things together became freedom and what people were fighting for as they were fighting against communism. And then in terms of people, and we'll get to countries, but people, that was people both outside the Iron Curtain and people inside the Iron Curtain. So outside the Iron Curtain, you have famous people like a President Truman or a President Reagan and some in between. But you also have people who are less well known. Some of them were elected, some of them weren't elected. Some of them were journalists, some of them were regular private citizens volunteering. I mean, just all different types, people in the military, all walks of life. And then behind the Iron Curtain, you had various people, including what came to be called officially dissidents. And I mentioned in my talk that these are the people who were resisting all the way through. Now, there were some dissidents who were more what we would call intellectual, right? They were talking about something or writing about something secretly, underground even, or typically. And they would, if it became known, sometimes they were arrested. Some of them were killed, different fates for different dissidents. But there were also a lot of regular people. So imagine every time a family learned something new, and they would say, okay, we're turning on the radio and we're going to whisper to each other in this one place in the house that we think isn't bugged. And they would share something that was about truth, because communism is based on lies, right? So they would share the truth. That made that person a dissident. That made that person somebody who was resisting, even if they wouldn't become a famous dissident like an Alexander Solzhenitsyn or a Václav Havel. So people inside the Iron Curtain, behind the Iron Curtain, people outside. And then the countries, gosh, we had the United States as a primary actor, all of the Western allies. And I said, that's not just geographic. And then countries, people who wouldn't let go of being, Latvian or being Polish or being Hungarian, whatever. Those people kept the ideas of their countries alive behind the Iron Curtain, and they helped to bring down things too. So all of that together helped to it makes them the heroes, the victors, the winners of the Cold War. And you'll note I didn't mention Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the last communist dictator of the Soviet Union, and had to change. And I do think he's a factor, but not in the way that these others were that helped to bring about an end to the Cold War. And he didn't want to end the Cold War. He just wanted to reform the Soviet Union and make it better socialist.
Well, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're out of time for today, but we do have other Streamable Learning classes coming up. And so last 30 seconds, where can students learn more about VOC?
So we have a website. Please go to our website, victimsofcommunism.org, and you can learn lots of individual facts and follow up to what we talked about today. You can learn about our museum, and the teachers in the crowd, you can learn about all of our academic programs. Some of the high schoolers can look at some of the content, but we've got stuff there for teachers, including a teacher's seminar. And then I just saw this one pop up. Lily's been doing a good job, but they can email you questions, right, Lily? You want to give the best contact information?
Yeah, so my email is lily.mchale@victimsofcommunism.org, and I'll type that in here. So if you have any questions about any academic programs, materials, feel free to reach out.
Been a pleasure being with you. I hope you all come to the museum. Put us on your itinerary when you're making your trips to Washington, D.C., please.
Thank you all. Have a good day.